Every cognitive bias explained, part 2, anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is when we place too much importance on the first piece of information we receive when making decisions. Once an anchor is established, it becomes hard to adjust our judgments even when new, better information comes along. For example, if a real estate agent shows you an expensive house first, that becomes the anchor, making other homes, whether actually affordable or not, seem like better deals. Bandwagon Effect. The bandwagon effect is the tendency to adopt behaviors, styles, or beliefs because others around us are doing the same. The more people who adopt a trend, the more likely we are to follow suit, often without critically thinking about the trend itself. This is common in areas like fashion, politics, and even stock market movements. For example, you may not have a strong opinion on a particular politician, but if everyone around you supports them, you might feel compelled to as well. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when we favor information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and ignore or dismiss information that challenges them. It's a form of selective thinking that can significantly skew our perspective. For instance, if you believe that eating a certain type of food improves your health, you're likely to search for articles that support this view and overlook studies that contradict it. Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger Effect describes how people with low ability or knowledge in a certain area tend to overestimate their competence, while experts tend to underestimate their abilities. This happens because, in the early stages of learning, individuals lack the skills to assess their own performance accurately. For example, a beginner cook might think they're ready to host a dinner party after mastering a few recipes, whereas a professional chef might still feel inadequate because they know just how much more there is to learn. Halo Effect. The halo effect occurs when our overall impression of someone influences how we feel and think about their character or abilities in unrelated areas. For example, if someone is physically attractive, we might assume they are also smart, kind, or competent in other areas. This cognitive bias is often exploited in marketing, where a celebrity endorsement can make a product seem better just because of the celebrity's popularity. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the habit of attributing successes to our own abilities or efforts while blaming external factors for failures. For example, if you perform well on a work project, you might credit your hard work or intelligence, but if the project fails, you're more likely to blame poor instructions or bad timing. This bias helps protect our self-esteem and makes us feel good about ourselves, but it can also prevent us from learning from our mistakes. People with a strong self-serving bias often struggle to accept responsibility for their shortcomings, which can make personal and professional growth more difficult. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that leads us to overestimate the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. For instance, after seeing news reports about a plane crash, you might overestimate the danger of flying, even though flying is statistically much safer than driving. This bias is driven by how recent or vivid the information is in our memory, rather than its actual relevance or likelihood. It can affect decisions ranging from what type of insurance to buy to how we perceive risks in everyday life, making us more fearful of rare events and less cautious about common dangers. Framing effect. The framing effect occurs when people make decisions based on how information is presented, rather than the information itself. For example, people are more likely to choose a medical procedure with a 90% success rate rather than one with a 10% failure rate, even though both statistics mean the same thing. The way options are framed, whether positively or negatively, can dramatically influence decision making, especially in situations involving risk. This bias shows how the wording and context of information can alter our perceptions, even when the facts remain unchanged. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe, after an event has occurred, that we knew it all along, or that the outcome was more predictable than it actually was. This bias can distort how we perceive past decisions and events, leading us to think that outcomes were obvious or inevitable, even if they were not. For instance, after a sports team wins a championship, fans might claim they always knew the team would win, despite having doubts earlier. Hindsight bias can make us overconfident in our ability to predict future events, and can also prevent us from learning from our past mistakes. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing time, money, or effort into something simply because of the previous investment, even when it would be better to cut losses and move on. For example, if you've spent months working on a failing project, you might continue investing in it just because you've already put so much time into it, even though stopping might be the more rational choice. This bias can lead to poor decision making as people focus on what they've already lost rather than what they could still gain or lose in the future. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that if something happens more frequently than normal during a given period, it will happen less frequently in the future, or vice versa. For example, if you flip a coin 5 times and get heads each time, you might believe that tails is due on the next flip, even though each flip is independent and has a 50-50 chance. This fallacy leads people to make risky decisions in gambling, investing, or other situations involving chance under the false assumption that probabilities will even out over time. Optimism bias. Optimism bias is the tendency to believe that we are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive ones compared to others. For example, someone might believe they are less likely to get into a car accident than the average driver, even though statistically they face the same risks. This bias can lead to underestimating dangers and overestimating one's own abilities or good fortune. While optimism can be beneficial for motivation and mental health, it can also lead to poor planning and risky behaviors if people fail to consider potential risks. Social comparison bias. Social comparison bias occurs when we compare ourselves to others in ways that impact our self-esteem, confidence, or happiness. For example, if a friend gets a promotion, you might feel inadequate even though you're doing well in your own job. This bias often leads to feelings of envy, insecurity, or competitiveness, especially in environments where social status or success is highly visible. While social comparison can sometimes motivate self-improvement, it more often causes stress and dissatisfaction by distorting how we view our own accomplishments. Illusory correlation. Illusory correlation happens when we perceive a relationship between two variables when no such relationship actually exists. For example, someone might believe that wearing a lucky shirt improves their chances of winning a game, even though there's no actual connection between the two. This bias can lead to superstitious thinking and irrational decision making, as people look for patterns or connections that aren't really there. In more serious cases, illusory correlations can contribute to stereotypes, where people incorrectly link certain traits or behaviors to specific groups. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is the tendency to focus on successful individuals or outcomes while ignoring those who didn't succeed, leading to a distorted understanding of reality. For example, reading about famous entrepreneurs might make it seem like starting a business is easy while overlooking the many failed startups that didn't make it. This bias can lead to overestimating the chances of success and underestimating the risks and challenges involved. It encourages people to adopt strategies or behaviors that seem successful without considering the full range of outcomes. Overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias occurs when people overestimate their own abilities, knowledge, or the accuracy of their predictions. For example, someone might feel certain they can predict the outcome of a stock market trend even though they don't have enough information or expertise to do so accurately. This bias leads to risky decision making as people take on challenges or make bets without adequately considering the potential downsides. Overconfidence can be particularly dangerous in fields like finance, medicine, or engineering, where poor decisions can have serious consequences. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is the tendency to overestimate how much others agree with our opinions, beliefs, or behaviors. For example, if you have a strong opinion on a political issue, you might assume that most people feel the same way, even though public opinion might be more divided. This bias can lead to misunderstandings and a skewed perception of reality, as individuals believe their views are more widely shared than they actually are. It can also make people less open to differing perspectives, as they assume their position is the normal one. Choice supportive bias. Choice supportive bias occurs when we remember our choices as better than they actually were, often focusing on the positives and downplaying any negatives. After making a decision such as buying a car or choosing a vacation destination, people tend to justify their choice by highlighting its good points, even if there were clear downsides. This bias helps protect our self-esteem and makes us feel more confident in our decisions, but it can also prevent us from learning from our mistakes or objectively evaluating past choices.